My Story by Marilyn Monroe. I was to go to a number of fancy Hollywood parties and stand among the glamorous figures, dressed as well as any of them, and laugh as if I were overcome with joy. But I never felt any more at ease than I did the first time I watched from the hallway. As soon as I could afford an evening gown, I bought the loudest one I could find. It was a bright red, low-cut dress, and my arrival in it usually infuriated half the women present. I was sorry in a way to do this, but I had a long way to go, and I needed a lot of advertising to get there. The first fame I achieved was a wave of gossip that identified me as Joe Schenck's girl. Mr. Schenck had invited me to his Beverly Hills mansion for dinner one evening. Then he fell into the habit of inviting me 2 or 3 times a week. I went to Mr. Schenck's mansion the first few times because he was one of the heads of my studio. After that, I went because I liked him. I seldom spoke 3 words during dinner, but would sit at Mr. Schenck's elbow and listen like a sponge. The fact that people began to talk about me, being Joe Schenck's girl, didn't annoy me at first. But later, it did annoy me. Mr. Schenck never so much as laid a finger on my wrist, or tried to. He was interested in me because I was a good table ornament, and because I was what he called an offbeat personality. I liked sitting around the fireplace with Mr. Schenck and hearing him talk about love and sex. He was full of wisdom on these subjects, like some great explorer. I also liked to look at his face. It was as much the face of a town as of a man. The whole history of Hollywood was in it. Perhaps the chief reason I was happy to have won Mr. Schenck's friendship was a great feeling of security it gave me. As a friend and protege of one of the heads of my own studio, what could go wrong for me? I got the answer to that question one Monday morning. I was called into the casting department and informed that I was being dropped by the studio, and that my presence would no longer be required. I couldn't talk. I sat listening and unable to move. The casting official explained that I had been given several chances, and that while I had acquitted myself fairly well, it was the opinion of the studio that I was not photogenic. I went to my room and lay down in bed and cried. I cried for a week. I didn't eat or talk or comb my hair. I kept crying as if I were at a funeral burying Marilyn Monroe. It wasn't only that I'd been fired. If they had dropped me because I couldn't act, it would have been bad enough. But it wouldn't have been fatal. I could learn, improve, and become an actress. But how could I ever change my looks? And I thought that was a part of me that couldn't miss. And imagine how wrong my looks must be if even Mr. Schenck had to agree to fire me. I lay crying day after day. I hated myself for having been such a fool and had illusions about how attractive I was. I got out of bed and looked in the mirror. Something horrible had happened. I wasn't attractive. I saw a coarse, crude-looking blonde. I was looking at myself with Mr. Zennick's eyes, and I saw what he had seen. A girl whose looks were too big a handicap for a career in the movies. The phone rang. Mr. Schenck's secretary invited me to dinner. I went. I sat through the evening feeling too ashamed to look into anyone's eyes. That's the way you feel when you're beaten inside. You don't feel angry at those who've beaten you. You just feel ashamed. I had tasted this shame early when a family would kick me out and send me back to the orphanage. When we were sitting in the living room, Mr. Schenck said to me, "How are things going at the studio?" I smiled at him because I was glad he hadn't had a part in my being fired. "I lost my job last week," I said. Mr. Schenck looked at me, and I saw 1,000 stories in his face. Stories of all the girls he had known who had lost jobs. Of all the actresses he heard her boasting and giggling with success and then moaning and sobbing with defeat. He didn't try to console me. He didn't take my hand or make any promises. The history of Hollywood looked out of his tired eyes at me, and he said, "Keep going." "I will," I said. "Try X Studio," Mr. Schenck said. "There might be something there." When I was leaving Mr. Schenck's house, I said to him, "I'd like to ask you a personal question. Do I look any different to you than I used to?" "You look the same as always," said Mr. Schenck. "Only get some sleep and stop crying." Thank you, I said.